You have no time but the present time. One of my disability heroes, Antonio Gramsci, was an Italian communist intellectual put into prison under Mussolini. Gramsci's famous motto was, "Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will." Where and how could we be optimistic in 2020? Faced with grim news of climate change and conflict and division, I think we have to remember and have faith. Things will not always be like this. A change is going to come. We may need to swap our lenses around from time to time if we're to see everything clearly. If vision is not your thing, consider how you might listen differently. It's about the different stories that we need to tell and the different perspectives that we should take. First, we might want to put everything in perspective. Humans are often very influenced by individual stories and do not always see the bigger picture. We tend to have headline anxiety. Worrying about stuff you can't affect is pointless. Far better to let some of it wash over you. The late Swedish academic Hans Rosling referred to factfulness as a means of keeping world news in perspective. If we focus on the bigger picture, such as the proportion of people living in extreme poverty halving in the past 20 years, it may be easier to remain hopeful. Rosling called it understanding as a source of mental peace. He said, when you hear about something terrible, calm yourself by asking, if there had been a positive improvement, would I have heard about that? We believe that the world is going to hell in a handcart, but that's simply not true. The New York Times journalist Nicholas Kristof reminds us, every single day in recent years, another 325,000 people got their first access to electricity. Each day, more than 200,000 people got piped water for the first time. And some 650,000 went online for the first time every single day. Historically, nearly half of all children died before adulthood. In 1950, approximately 1/4 died in childhood. Now, less than 5% do. 10% of people now live in extreme poverty, defined as subsisting on less than $2 a day. But in 1981, 42% of people lived in extreme poverty. World literacy is now 85% of the population. When I was born in 1966, it was less than half of the population. The coronavirus is going to devastate the societies of the global south, but it won't halt this sort of progress for long. One question is about framing, by which I mean what is remembered and what is unheard. Today, too often, we hear more about the percentage that goes wrong rather than the percentage that goes well. The media focuses on disasters and bad news stories. Given that psychology tells us how much better our brains are at holding on to the negative than the positive, this active effort does seem worthwhile. We should not pretend things are better than they are, but too much pessimism is paralyzing. Secondly, we might want to look in close-up. What I mean is, if we take out our magnifying glass and look in detail, we may be able to observe examples of good practice that are obscure if only we look at first glance. For example, over the last few years, I've been doing research with disabled people in Africa who've had success. The story we get about disability in Africa is mostly negative. Disabled kids are more likely to be out of school. Households with disabled members face multidimensional poverty. But that's not the whole story. Quite easily, my collaborators and I gathered more than 100 stories of disabled people in Uganda, Kenya, and Zambia who had achieved success in their lives on an equal basis to others. They had demonstrated resilience, which is partly about their own determination and intelligence, but it's also about the support they received from family members who believed in them, teachers who had backed them, organizations that had given them concrete support, whether that's a wheelchair or paying their school fees or university fees. As a result, my respondents had ended up as civil servants or lawyers, or farmers, or teachers, or shopkeepers, doing well and usually married and with kids of their own too. Not only did these folk proudly tell me I was the only member of my family to finish school, in turn they were supporting siblings or relatives through school, paying it forward. Every one of them challenges the stereotype that disabled people cannot succeed, that they're a bad investment, that the disabled child will never amount to anything, but none of them could have done it on their own. Another example, people with intellectual disabilities do not want to be socially isolated, which they sometimes are, in group homes set in the community, but not of the community. I found that many people I spoke to in my research in the United Kingdom had experienced bullying. Before gathering these stories, I didn't think it was possible that anybody could be so vile to people with intellectual disabilities, which is why WAVE for Change in Muswell Hill is important. WAVE stands for We Are All Valued Equally, a social enterprise aiming to provide integrated spaces for those with intellectual disabilities and those without. They run a cafe, a weekly playgroup for children with special needs, a young adult group, an inclusive church, research gauging attitudes to disability in their local area, and an award for the local business doing most to be inclusive to those with intellectual disabilities. They stand for the unconditional love of God and the drive to build communities that are welcoming to all. In Norfolk, where I used to live, Sing Your Heart Out is a network of community singing workshops aimed at those with mental health problems. But this is a voluntary arts group, not a branch of social services. People come as individuals, and there's no requirement to disclose anything. However, Sing Your Heart Out, SIHO, has become a lifeline to many people who've been receiving treatments for mental illness. As one participant said, "It's given me a lot of confidence. I was scared and anxious, and I was only used to unfriendly people. I got welcomed. The people were very nice. I enjoyed it." Each week, in 4 different towns across Norfolk, people gather for an afternoon of communal singing, with excellent singing teachers to guide them. Singing is powerful in itself, making people feel part of something bigger than themselves. But the event is more than an arts project. The afternoon includes a tea break with good biscuits, and there is conversation and sometimes problem solving and referral to other sources of support. A regular event each week is sometimes the only activity for which people leave the house. People's morale improves. They often require less medication to calm and console them. This is a low-cost intervention requiring only the room hire, refreshments and payment to those singing teachers. During coronavirus, it's all been online. Developed by Professor Dixon Chibanda, the Friendship Bench intervention for common mental disorders has been running in Zimbabwe since 2006. After a successful trial, it has now been scaled up to more than 70 primary healthcare centres in Zimbabwe. Lay health workers, most often grandmothers, aged on average 58 with 8 years of schooling, will deliver a problem-solving intervention at a bench placed near a clinic. There are now approximately 400 grandmothers involved as lay health workers and about 30 grandfathers too. It starts with opening the mind. The client shares his or her story. Then comes uplifting. The health worker helps the client prioritize the problems and brainstorm solutions. Next comes reassurance, checking to see if all went well, making a home visit if necessary. After 5 sessions on the Friendship Bench, the client is invited to join a support group. People get a chance to share their experiences. People are taught to crochet bags or mats from recycled plastic materials. This helps keep people productive, making their minds peaceful. There might also be singing or prayer. Quakers in particular will take heart from an intervention developed by my colleagues at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, aimed at reducing bullying in schools. Learning together is based on a whole school approach, which changes policies and systems, not just lessons in class. A key element is to increase student engagement with school. The second is restorative justice, which aims to resolve conflicts between students or between teachers and students. When victims tell perpetrators how their behaviour has affected them, this can lead to a change. Finally, social and emotional education teaches young people skills for managing relationships. After 2 years, bullying had reduced by nearly 10%. Students had higher quality of life and well-being and were less likely to have tried alcohol or drugs or to be regular smokers. Let's think about homelessness. Almost every week of the year, on a Tuesday, at a community kitchen in Ramsgate, the St George's Community Meal project brings together people who are homeless, who have substance misuse problems, or are simply isolated. Folk might have had problems with universal credit or homelessness in a local economy in Thanet which is far from resilient. Over a year, over 300 people benefit, with about 40 people on a typical evening. The project is staffed by volunteers from local churches and funded by the diocese. Local restaurants often help by providing the meals. It's a very low-key project with a huge welcome for everyone. What about children in care? New Beginnings is a project in Stockport run by Yadwiga Lee. She works with families who are known to local authority childcare services. Often, these are mothers who are misusing drugs or alcohol, or are survivors of domestic abuse, or mothers whose children had previously been removed by child services. New Beginnings recognises that parents are yesterday's children. Most failing mothers are themselves victims of abuse and poverty and exclusion. Over 24 weeks, mothers are taken through a therapeutic process which helps them recognise how wider contextual issues have caused the problems that they face today. New Beginnings enables mothers to connect with each other. They feel less alone. They get their children back and mentor others. All these stories tell us that good things are happening when you look close up. They show how human beings have the capacity to bounce back. And perhaps most importantly, they are evidence that when people work together in a common purpose, things improve. A change is going to come. If you believe in people, rather than resorting to stereotypes, they can be different. Together, we are building the kingdom of heaven. Finally, we might want to take the long view. Bad things are hard to endure, sometimes impossible to endure, but everything passes. In Britain, the Blitz must have been terrifying. In my local park in Kennington, there's a very moving memorial to those who died when an air raid shelter, simply a network of trenches in the ground, had a direct hit. Mostly women and children, the youngest just 3 months old, were killed, at least 100 and maybe many more. The memorial stone there has a quotation from Maya Angelou. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Across Britain, at least 40,000 people died as a result of the wartime bombing. In the firebombing of Dresden in February 1944 by Allied forces, up to 25,000 people died. Taking a long view helps, not to forget, but to move on. As with the terrible events of the Holocaust, we can never not remember. We could say the same of the AIDS epidemic, which kills so many millions. There are lessons to learn, but we do not have to live this terror again every day. It's not just that bad things end and time passes. Sub specie eternitatis is 17th century philosopher Baruch de Spinoza's phrase for putting things in the context of eternity. It's a good exercise, particularly if you think you are very important or if you think that someone else is pretty worthless, or if you think that some problem is irresolvable. If we take a long view, what does it matter what you've earned or how many mountains you have climbed? As the Italian proverb states, after the game, the king and the pawn go back into the same box. We usually take a subjective view, considering how things matter to us, where if we take an objective view, we might be more sanguine. Disasters give way to recovery, that problems can be mitigated, that good triumphs in the end. I'm not saying that all these deaths don't matter in the long run. Usually things rally because of human collective action, as with the school climate strikes, and Extinction Rebellion, and HIV treatment activism, which shows that we should not simply surrender to events which we believe we cannot control. But if we take a long view, then we might be less pessimistic about everyday problems and more hopeful for long-term resolutions.